My name is Patrick Milas, and I am the CE consultant here at the Bureau of Library Development. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce Blake Robinson, our Florida Collection and Outreach Librarian. Blake.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having us today. Today we're going to be talking about helping patrons with genealogy research. Next slide, please. All right, just a moment. Slides. Okay, so I am the Florida Collection and Outreach Librarian for the State Library. So my job responsibilities involve outreach to state government employees, overseeing our Florida Special Collection, and also answering reference questions. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Miriam Spalding from the State Archives. And she is the Archives Reference Coordinator, and she works a lot with public policy research and with agency records, and she is also our in-house genealogy specialist.
Hi, nice to be here.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and talk about today's topics. I'm going to, first of all, give us a little brief overview of the State Library and Archives and how we work. I'm going to talk a little bit about understanding genealogists and their information needs, some strategies for the reference interview, some key genealogy and local history resources, and we'll follow up with Q&A at the end. All right, so there are three parts to what people often call the State Library and the State Archives. The formal name is the Division of Library and Information Services, so I'll just give a quick rundown of that. I'm in the Bureau of Library and Network Services, which is more commonly known as the State Library. We specialize in the published history of Florida, including the Florida Special Collection, and we are also the library of record for state government documents here in Florida. Miriam works in the Bureau of Archives and Records Management, and they specialize in the unpublished history of Florida, agency records, and they also oversee the Florida Memory Project. And finally, Melissa and Patrick work in the Bureau of Library Development, and they oversee webinars such as this one and the Florida Electronic Library, and also grants and continuing education. All right, Miriam.
Okay, so today I'm going to talk a bit about genealogists and why do people do genealogy, why are they coming in and asking you stuff, how do you deal with them, and I've known a lot of librarians who get kind of freaked out about this, and it's no big deal. They're doing historical research. That's really all it is. So I have been here since 1998. I was actually hired because of my background in working with genealogy, and I've learned a lot working here, and so I'm hoping to impart some of that to y'all today. Okay, so genealogists, what is genealogy and why do people do it, basically? Genealogy is the study or investigation of ancestry and family history. And usually what is produced from this study is a record like a family tree or a narrative history of the descent of a family or person from one or more ancestors. So why do people do this? A lot of people do this as a hobby or out of curiosity. Some people do it to maintain family connections that they may have between cousins and far-flung branches of a family. They may have some special ancestor that they're proud of or their family origins. Some people may pursue it for a family medical history. They may have something that they are trying to track down or keep track of in their medical history. And other people might be working on a lineage society where they want to be a member of, say, the Daughters of the American Revolution or the United Daughters of the Confederacy or one of these other groups. So what are these people looking for when they're doing this? What genealogists are usually looking for is information that links individuals in a particular time and place. That's how you can show connections to people. They will use historical records or oral traditions or family artifacts or any other source to find information on a family and to show how these people are kin to each other. So when you deal with a genealogist comes in and wants to talk, they tell you, I need to do my family history. The first step is the reference interview. So usually what I ask them is, what are you looking for today? You know, are you looking for census records? Are you looking for information on a specific place? Or are you looking for information on a time period? So what I ask them is, what have you looked at already? Have you looked at census records? Have you looked at courthouse records? Do you have, do you have vital records already? So have you looked at Ancestry.com? A lot of people are looking at those these days. So what you want to do is find out where they're at, so you can help them determine where they need to go. So, yeah, so what sources have they consulted? What have they found? What are they looking for today? Okay. To determine where they need to go, you want to analyze the information that they have that is known. So usually names, dates, and places. Most people will, they know their own name and birth date. They usually know their parents' names, birth dates, and where they grew up. Most people know their grandparents. It's getting past that they kind of need to figure out. So what I tell people to do is to start with themselves and go from the known to the unknown. Go from yourself and work your way back. And from there, in order to figure out where to go, you have to find what sources are going to be useful for that. Okay. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the methodology. Next one. Okay. So, like I said, begin with yourself, and then your parents and your grandparents. You want to get the names, the dates, and places, because that's how you actually find information. Is you link names and people in a particular place and time, and how they are in relation to each other. So some of the significant life events that you want to look for are things like births, marriage, death, emigration, travel, that sort of thing. You want to, again, work your way backwards in time. Don't skip any steps. And a pedigree chart can sometimes help with visualizing unknown information. A pedigree chart, you can find a lot of these blank ones online. Family Search has got them, and Ancestry has them. You fill them in, and as far back as the patron can go, and the blank spots will show you where you need to go. One of the things that I tell people to do when they come in is to look for things in the home first, because people may not realize that they've got valuable information just kind of lying around in their house or at grandma's house. So some of the things that you may find in the home is family Bibles. There's many of these old Bibles would have had pages in there that could be filled in with listing births or marriages or deaths. Birth and death certificates may be lying around in somebody's papers. Baptism records, marriage records, divorce papers, funeral cards. You see that often, especially at Catholic funerals. You probably see them at other funerals, is a funeral card with a little bit of scripture and the information on that person. Birth and marriage announcements you might see, those get sent out. Other sources you might find is a scrapbook with newspaper clippings in it. There may be photo albums, and those are great because not only do you have the picture of the person in there, but there may be information on the back with the names and the dates. May have a picture of the house in the background where they grew up with a house number. So, just looking at a picture can actually provide you with a lot of information. You might find letters and diaries from people. That'll give you background information on their lives and who they were in contact with. Yearbooks, either school yearbooks or military training camp kind of basic training handbooks. You can see that the connections that people had with each other. Immigration and naturalization papers will show, when they came into a country, and it may give you information on where they came from, which could be extremely valuable. Military records can give you some info on, what was the person doing when, and often they list who was the next of kin on some of these things. There may be a physical description of somebody who's long gone that you don't have a picture for. And deed records for property can also be a big clue as to where people were. And never discount relatives as a source of information. So first step is you want to be able to go and talk to people. If you go to a family reunion, go there with your notebook or a recorder or anything and go and talk to people and start collecting stories. I have a lot of people come into the archives preparing to go to a family reunion and want to do preliminary research before they go. So that's always a plus, for people to work on this a little bit so they have a better idea what to ask when they go to this family reunion. So you can also formally interview relatives. You can make a connection with an older relative, make up a list of questions beforehand, take notes when you talk to them, or if they agree, you can record them or video them, and bring scrapbooks or bring photo albums or bring unidentified pictures and go through them and try to elicit some stories, elicit names and dates and events and that kind of thing, and all of that is useful. So this is all advice that I tell patrons, and some of them have done this already and others go, oh my God, what a great idea. So organizing research is pretty key, and it's not that hard these days because you can, again, blank pedigree charts you could find on the internet. Those will show a lineal descent from, you show yourself and your parents, your great-grandparents, your great-grandparents, usually like 4-generation or 5-generation charts you can find out there. A family group sheet will show a kind of a nuclear family. It'll show a mother, a father, and then the children, so that you can keep a list of all the kids in a family and explore kind of laterally. So some people do come in with binders full of these pedigree charts and family group sheets and other stuff. But to my mind, it's a lot easier to use a genealogy program.
And we just had a note that some of you have lost audio. If you guys can hear us, can you type into the chat panel?
Where I think I left off was about organizing your research. So I had been going over again about pedigree charts and family group sheets, which respectively one does linear descendants and one does a family group, including all of the children instead of just one. Where I was about to go on that was it may be a little more less onerous, I should say, to have all your records on a flash drive perhaps instead of on a big binder full of paper sheets. So a lot of people do use genealogy computer programs these days. There's several out there. A couple of popular ones are Family Tree Maker and Legacy Family Tree, but pretty much any program that you can find would be useful. For most of them do the same thing. You can enter in people and keep it as a database, and it will demonstrate connections between people. The real basic thing that you want is to be able to have a database, and it should allow importing and exporting files as well as have space for citations. Also, research logs. It's a good idea to keep a log of the resources that you have consulted to avoid looking in the same place twice or more than twice, as I have done in the past because I wasn't keeping up with what I was supposed to be doing. You may check a site and not find anything and then check it again because you didn't think about it. But if you keep a research log, that way you know that you already consulted this particular resource and you've listed what you found there. And always, always, always cite sources. Tell people to cite their sources. There's a lot of information on family trees that are floating out there on the internet with no citations for where they got that information, which kind of makes it useless. If you can't back it up, it's not really worth anything. You know, you'd have to investigate it all over again. So those are some of the basic things for organizational purposes. Genealogy resources. I'm going to talk about some of the major resources and the differences between primary and secondary sources. Some of the major genealogy resources is primary source documents, which are documents that were created at the time under study, secondary sources, which were not and may have come from one or more steps removed from the event, or may interpret or analyze primary sources. There's also internet and databases and handbooks, indexes, and bibliographies. So a primary source document, a single document may be both. It may be a primary source document for one event, but a secondary source for another. And the example that I'm using here is a death certificate will have information about the death. It's a primary source because it was created at the time of the death. You would have the date of death and the name of the person and the doctor who signed off on it and the name of the person who is filling in the information for the death certificate. But the secondary, it's going to be a secondary source for the birth date. You'll see on a death certificate will be a birth date, but that was not created at the time of the birth in most cases anyway. So the person reporting it, somebody who dies as an elderly person, there's probably not going to be anybody around who can report exactly on the birth date. That makes it a secondary source. So, whenever possible, use a primary source document because that is usually the most reliable. That's you know, a fairly good standard to go with is use the document that was created at the time of the event. If there are no primary source documents available, use secondary sources, but you have to treat them with caution. You can try to use multiple secondary sources that match up together to try to build up a case for a conclusion on that. Some of the primary source documents I'm going to talk about are civil and religious vital records, which would include birth records, baptisms, marriages, divorces, deaths, and burials. Birth, marriage, death, and divorce records in Florida, for example, are kept by the Department of Health, Office of Vital Statistics, in Jacksonville. We get a lot of people calling us at the state archives for these. In Florida, the archives does not keep these. It's the Department of Health. In Florida, most of the records date from 1927, when the records started to be kept comprehensively, but there may be earlier birth and death records as far back as the 1870s, but that's generally going to have been in urban areas, like big cities where that might have been taking place. There is no public index for birth records in Florida. Those are kept very confidential. Death, marriage, and divorce indexes for Florida. We have got some microfiche from the Department of Health, but these indexes are also available on Ancestry, which is where I consult them most of the time. You will also find, go back one real quick. County courthouses will also hold marriage and divorce records for their county, but the clerk of the county courthouse will be responsible for those. Wills, probate, estate, and guardianship records and deeds are also located at the courthouse. You might also find 19th century naturalizations, delayed birth certificates, and post-World War I and World War II soldier and sailor discharge records. Now, religious records, you may find either in the church, if it has a regional diocese office, they may be kept there. A baptism record is a good placeholder for a birth record. Will usually take place around the same time. Marriage records you will find for religious ceremonies, funerals, for deaths. And some churches have their own cemeteries, and they may have a sexton who is in charge of taking care of the cemetery, and there may be cemetery records for the burials there. And Blake was going to talk about a little bit about religious records as well.
Hey folks, this is Blake again. I'd just like to draw your attention to a couple resources that we have here at the State Library. Another very useful source for religious genealogy information are some of the church minutes and publications produced by the churches themselves. And there's quite a range of denominations here in Florida, and we keep pretty extensive collections of these both on microfilm and in print. So if you ever need a date, we're happy to look that up for you. For some churches, you'll find names of elders and presbyters and other church officials that you won't be able to find that information anywhere else. For those of you in academic libraries, you can find some church minutes on HathiTrust, but they're few and far between. The other major source that I'd like to draw your attention to are the WPA church surveys, and these were done during the New Deal by the Works Progress Administration during Franklin Delano Roosevelt's administration, and these folks went in and inventoried the history of the church and some of the founding documents and other information, and these are all available online for Florida at Florida Memory, so that's floridamemory.com, and those are free for anyone to use. All right, Miriam?
All righty. Okay, next slide. Okay, federal, state, and county records. So the big one that everybody uses for research in the United States anyway is federal census records. That's the big one. That's the most basic. Many of the states also conducted state census records, including Florida. Other records that are useful are immigration and naturalization records, wills and probate, which I touched on earlier, military records, land records, and voter records. Let's see. Census records are among the most valuable and basic resources for genealogy because they provide a snapshot of the household at a particular time and place. The federal census has been taken every 10 years since 1790. Between 1790 and 1840, they only listed the head of the household, and the dependents were listed as hash marks, essentially. So you would know basically how many females and how many males were in the household and sort of an age range for each. But for the purposes of the census, they were really only interested in who was going to be able to vote, and that would have been generally the male head of the household. In 1850, they started recording everybody in the household, and that's when it starts getting really super useful for genealogical purposes. Those list the head of the household and the rest of the people and their relationship to the head of the household, their ages, their sexes, their races, their birthplace, and their age. So it really is a snapshot of what a household looks like. These census records were taken every year and have been. So 1850 up through 1940 is what's available right now. There's a 72-year privacy statute in place that so you're not allowed to actually look at anything more recent than 1940. But the only one that's not really available is the 1890 that burned in a fire at the National Archives in the early 70s, I believe, and was mostly lost. There's a few chunks of it, but the vast majority of the 1890 is missing. You can use some substitutions if you can't find people in census, or you're trying to figure out where were people between 1880 and 1900. One of those is state censuses. Florida did a state census every 10 years between 1845 and 1945, with a couple of exceptions. Unfortunately, most of those census records are gone or they're incomplete. For instance, the 1845 is basically just a one sheet that's got a number totals. There's no names to it. 1855 and 1875 are fragmentary. The most complete ones are the 1885 census, which is can be very helpful as a substitute for the lost 1890 census. That the original of that is actually held in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. The 1935 and the 1945. 1895, 1905, 1915, and 1925 are not ones that are held by the state archives, and they're not thought to exist. Although I believe Jacksonville Public Library has got a copy of the 1895 Nassau County Census. And there are some precincts missing for 1935 and 1945, but it's mostly fairly complete. Military records are useful in several ways. We're looking here at a copy of the service card for Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, the author of River of Grass, important Floridian. She actually served during World War I, and it gives you a few details there about her. Gives you her service number, and it tells you her age when she entered and her the date that she entered, where she entered from, and her rank and where she served. And she basically just served at headquarters in Key West, as you can see there. So that gives you a little snapshot of what she was doing during World War I. That's a service record. A draft record will also give a lot of personal information on a person. Will give their age and their birthplace, if they have dependents or if they're married. Sometimes it will give eye color and hair color and height. Will certainly give where they were filling out the form from. Pension applications are usually, you find that from service members who served in conflicts. It will give details of their service, but it will also, pension applications are great because they also will give a lot of information about their dependents. So it can link a veteran and their children and their wife, and maybe give a lot of other personal details that a service record may not. A service record is just basically, in many cases, a muster roll, for instance, is just going to give you where they mustered into service, and the conflicts they served in, the particular battles and the places they were at, where they might have been discharged, that kind of thing. All those are good clues. Immigration and naturalization. Many people are going to be looking for some sort of record of where their ancestor came from. A lot of these are going to be federal, and they're going to be found in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., or the satellite branches. Passenger lists and port records, they usually list the ship name, the port sailed out of, and the date of arrival. You can see who sailed together on these lists, and it's great for finding the place of origin. For instance, if you're looking for people who entered the United States through Ellis Island, that's an example of a port record. Those are actually available online. There's the Ellis Island Foundation has got them. I believe you can just register, but you can get in there for free and look at those. The naturalization process is actually a process. People would have to declare an intention to become a citizen. So you would have to declare your intention and file that at any courthouse, and that could have been at the federal, state, or county level. And after a couple more years, they could file a petition to become a citizen at another courthouse, and then they would receive a certificate of naturalization. And because of the length of time between steps, it might be difficult to track down the documents of the naturalization process. So, for example, an immigrant might arrive at New York and travel to live with relatives in Chicago, where they might file their declaration, and then they might have traveled further west on the Oregon Trail or something and file their petition anywhere along the way. So tracking migration patterns might be useful on that. Land records are good for indicating residence, and they might also demonstrate the economic health of a family by how much land they own, if they're able to buy land and work it. Also, the transfer of property via deeds might also demonstrate relationships between relatives and closely allied families. Land grants are usually, and patents are usually granted by a government entity. For example, we have Spanish land grants. There's an example there on the page that were made by the Spanish government of Florida in the Second Spanish period, which was 1784 to 1821. When the U.S. government took over Florida in 1821, 1822, they set up a board to review land claims. Individuals claiming these grants had to be able to prove their claim with documentation and get their neighbors to testify to the government board when it took over. We have got confirmed and unconfirmed claims, mostly for East Florida, digitized on Florida memory. And a lot of the records are in Spanish, but there are records in English, but place names and names of individuals are searchable on that. So especially, it's heavily concentrated in the St. Augustine area, but I would check all on the eastern coast of Florida if someone's interested in that and is definitely looking for some kind of background for Spanish Florida. Okay. Voter records, lists of voters they show that a voter was a resident in a particular time and at a particular place. One of the things that's important for some researchers in Florida is the statehood election in 1845. The State Genealogical Society has what's called the Pioneer Certificate Program, where people can get a certificate if they can prove descent from a person who was present in Florida, lived in Florida in 1845. And
Hi, this is Melissa just breaking in here. We've got a couple of reports that you guys don't have audio. Can you let me know if you can hear us? We've definitely had some wonky audio stuff going on today, so I just want to make sure that, okay. So we do have people that can hear. They're saying it's all right.
Okay.
Just let us know if you guys lose audio. It's cutting in and out, they say. We're doing the best we can. This is something that has to do with the software. So just let us know if it cuts out again so that we don't just keep going on.
All right. Okay, so 1845, lists of voters. People had to vote on whether or not to enter the United States. So if we've got those digitized on Florida memory, and that's got lists of people who voted at the various precincts. That's searchable and digitized on Florida memory. So that's a great help to somebody who's trying to do a Pioneer Certificate research, if they can find an ancestor there. So lists of voters, we have a few here at the archives. You can also possibly find them with county supervisors of election, and that'll vary from county to county.
All right, and folks, this is Blake again. I just want to add to what Miriam is saying. One of the resources that is really great for local historians, who are pretty much the same folks as genealogists, is the reports of the Secretary of State. And basically, these have been done for in one way or another since statehood, and these reports will give you the names of public officials, clerks of court, prominent folks in your county, and they will essentially give you an electoral makeup and give you sort of a picture or a portrait of what people were thinking and doing politically at that time. So they're a great primary source for folks who are doing this sort of thing, for doing local history. And you can find those online in our catalog, and that's library.florida.gov. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. All right. At the local level, you can find at the county courthouse wills and probate records. Some people may not understand what the probate process is, but you may have heard of a will being read, maybe in popular culture, scenes in a movie or something like that. A person, especially a landowner, will file a copy of their will at the local county courthouse, and that's to indicate how their property is to be disposed at their death. We'll usually list out, what their property is and how it's to be distributed and name off people who's supposed to get what. Some people do not file a will, and if there is no will but there is property to be dispersed, it will go through a probate process. The judge will determine, or the court will determine, which relatives are heirs in the probate process. And that usually involves, you will usually have a probate packet when someone is searching for court records on this. It will contain the death date and the death place, the names of the family members, a description or inventory of the state, the land that's owned, and any guardianships or adoptions for minor children. So these probate records are really good because they will name off children, often will name off people and what their relationship is, whether they're children or nephews or nieces or in-laws or whatever. If you are doing, for instance, slave research, slaves may be named in these probate records prior to the Civil War. So that's another important thing right there. So the probate stuff, that's you will find a lot of indexes and that sort of thing, but the courthouses is where you need to get access to this. Secondary sources, as opposed to what we were just talking about, which are all primary sources, you're going to find things. A lot of this stuff is going to be what you find in a genealogy collection in a library. You'll have compiled kind of books like Southern Families. You'll have indexes to census records, marriage records, other types of indexes, cemetery transcriptions, compiled family histories where somebody's gone through and compiled all this stuff together and written out a narrative. You may have compiled newspaper articles or just plain old newspaper articles. Obituaries are a secondary source. And local histories may give you a lot of information on a family, especially if they were pioneers in a particular area. And the original records were compiled, interpreted or transcribed by the compiler or indexer. So they may put together a whole bunch of facts. But the thing to watch out for is to make sure that they have cited where they received this information from or where they drew it from. You may also want to direct the patron, who's looking at compiled sources, back to the original record cited, because there is always the possibility of errors in interpretation or spelling. They need to be able to draw their own conclusions from the evidence. And online resources, the internet is a great thing, and it's a great thing for many things, but especially genealogy, because a lot of people used to have to do all this stuff via writing letters back in the day before there was an internet. So there's more stuff available online than ever before, and there's a lot of reliable stuff, and there is a lot of stuff that is very, very you have to be very cautious of. So I would say secondary sources on the internet you have to be even more concerned about, because some people will say it's on the internet, so it must be true. Not so. So compiled information, family trees, transcriptions, anything like that's a secondary source on the internet, be careful of. So some of the sites online that are good resources are Ancestry is the big one. A lot of people like to use that. Many libraries may have a subscription to it as an institutional subscription. There's tons of good stuff on Ancestry, but even on Ancestry, there's some sketchy stuff that you want to be careful of. Fold3 is a site that has a lot of military service records, especially from the Civil War, and that is a really good source for that. There's also a lot of other federal type of material. Genealogy.com is more of a site that's got a lot of user information on it. A lot of it's from Family Tree Maker users. And Heritage Quest has been recently purchased by Ancestry. It's still a separate site for some reason, but it's got some material that is different from what you find on Ancestry. Most of these will provide access to primary source material, as in the actual digitized image, and that's what you want to go for. But it will also give you user supply secondary source information like these compiled family trees or forums or pages on people, that sort of thing. In addition to the subscription sites, so if you have somebody on a budget, you don't have access to Ancestry, there are free sites out there that are great. FamilySearch.org is probably the best one in my opinion. That has a lot of actual digitized records on it, and they have an active transcription volunteer program going on where the records are being made more accessible and more searchable by transcribing them. Cindy's List is a site that's been going on for probably 20 years now, and it's like a giant index of various subheadings under genealogy. So any kind of specialty thing you can think of, you can look at on Cindy's List. US GenWeb is an earlier kind of transcription volunteer site where they have people going into local records and transcribing them and putting them up. It's not quite as useful in some cases as Family Search, but it's certainly worth a look. The internet forums are very good for connecting with people who may be searching in a similar area. So you find some of that on the Ancestry.com message boards. There's blogs out there on methodology and research. There's even Facebook groups for people doing specific kinds of research.
All right, folks. Hi, folks. Can you all hear me? This is Blake again.
Yeah.
All right. So just to complement what Miriam is saying, the State Library has a number of local history resources as well, and these are going to provide additional context to your patrons when they're doing genealogy resources, or genealogy research, my apologies. You may get the who and what from the genealogy, but you can place things in historical context and figure out what was an ancestor's role in the community life at the time. And here at the State Library, we have a huge collection of local histories from all 67 counties in the state. And you're going to find information in there that you won't find anywhere else. A lot of these are labors of love that are not published by major presses. It might be your neighbor or your friend or your cousin that publishes these. And they're, like Miriam was saying, they do need to be verified against other sources, but sometimes they're the only place you can find certain things. And what I'd like to go ahead and highlight are county histories. And you can find these at info.florida.gov/bibliographies. And our county histories give a greatest hits of all of books about all 67 Florida counties. We have research copies of all of these in our Florida special collection here at the State Library. And for most of these, we also have second circulating copies that we can lend through ILL. So if you have a patron who needs that special bit of information on Calhoun County, or you want to evaluate a book before purchasing it for your own collection, we're happy to do that for you. I'd also like to go ahead and highlight our Florida newspaper collection. We keep microfilm of newspapers for most major cities here in Florida from the late 1880s, I would say, to the present for most papers, and we also have some historical reels as well. We lend those out throughout the state, and those are great sources for folks who are doing obituary research, or they have an event that happened in their town and they want a primary source to corroborate that. That's a great place to go. And finally, I'd like to talk about our city directories. These are published mostly by the Polk Company, and we have the entire run of these for most cities basically from World War I to the present. And these are great for if you want to track how someone has moved over time, or if they lived in one city and 5 years later maybe they moved to another city. You can trace your ancestors' movement through time, and sometimes this is the only way that you can do that.
Okay. All right. Sometimes you reach the end of what you can do for a person, patron that comes into your library. So referrals should always be something that you're prepared to do, and to know where you're going to refer them is sometimes the valuable thing. So what I would say is you have a knowledge of libraries with genealogical collections. Know that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, in other words, the Mormons, have family history centers that are available. Genealogical societies sometimes have their own databases or libraries or just regular meetings that you can refer people to. The National Archives in Washington, D.C., and their branches, and the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis is where most 20th century military records are. So for older military records pre-World War I, you would refer them to D.C., but for more recent, you would send them to St. Louis, to the National Personnel Records Center. And just an additional word about the family history centers. They're really great because they are staffed by volunteers who are just there doing it for the enjoyment of it. But for that reason, you need to call ahead before you refer somebody over there, because they may be only open to the public like one day a week. So it's important to get the hours. You can look on FamilySearch.org, and it will have a listing of these family history centers, so you can find one near you. Professional researchers are another thing another weapon that you can hand to a person. If they have something very difficult, if they've been researching and they have a brick wall where they just can't get past it, can't find out anything more about that particular branch of the family, they may want to hire a professional researcher to take a fresh look at it. If they have problems with accessing remote records, on the other side of the country, they can't make a research trip over there. Or if they would just simply, rather pay somebody to do this for them, you can refer them to professional researchers. Now, there is no certification process for this. Anybody can hang up a shingle and call themselves a professional genealogist. So, references are always a great thing. Though there are some credential programs available. I think BYU is one of them that might do that, Brigham Young University in Salt Lake City. But there's also an Association of Professional Genealogists, and they have a website, and they maintain a member directory that usually has specialties. So people can look up a genealogist, they can go online and look for one, and they can ask for references, and that's the best way to do it. Some of the other resources for genealogy is, these are some of the books are on the left side of your screen there. The Genealogist Address Book. A lot of this information you can get off the internet, but it does have some good additional information like the date ranges of records that they have. And maybe I have noticed that some clerk's offices don't make their phone number very easy to find on their websites. So this is a good thing. The Source is a really good book on to hand people just to get them started. If they are brand new to genealogy, this will show them kind of the methodology and some of the background that we've just been talking about. And the Handy Book for Genealogists, I love this thing. I have it on my ready reference shelf. It has lists of states and the county creation dates and phone numbers again for county courthouses and all sorts of information about local history. And some of these websites on the right I've already talked about, but those are the major ones.
All right, folks, this is Blake again. I want to go ahead and spotlight some of the resources that we have on our Ready Reference shelf at the State Library. The major one, if you have only one of these, you want to get the Atlas of Historical County Boundaries. There are 67 counties in Florida, and from the 1820s to the 1920s, these were being continuously carved up until the creation of Gilchrist County in 1926. So if you're in the Central Florida area, for instance, and you have someone who is looking for records in Seminole County for 1835, that's not going to do them a lot of good because Seminole County was actually created out of Orange County much later. So you'll want to take account of how the boundaries shifted and changed over time to make sure that folks get the information they need. The second major one is the chronology of Florida post offices. The presence of a post office in a town is a sign of that settlement was there, and it's often one of the only ways to keep track of towns that have disappeared over time or that no longer exist. Chances are, if there's a post office in that town, there's at least some additional documentation about that town that can give you some context. The Florida Historical Quarterly, of course, is the journal of record for Florida history. A lot of that work is quite scholarly, of course, and covers general Florida history, but you can find in-depth scholarly articles about cities and places and towns, and these are, of course, very heavily footnoted and have extensive endnotes, so these are a great resource for folks if they're willing to dive into those. And those are mostly available online. And the local history collections and libraries is a great resource for collection development. And finally, the National Gazetteer is a great source for place names.
Okay. I was going to go briefly over some specialized research topics that you may get questions on, so that may throw you a little bit. The three that I get most often that are somewhat specialized are adoption, Native American research, and African American research. Adoption in Florida is a difficult subject in Florida because most of the information is closed. It is sealed. The specifics are not available to any of the parties involved, birth parents, adoptive parents, or adopted children. This is very difficult if one party is searching but the other is not. So one of the tools for researching in that, the records are actually held by the Florida Department of Children and Families, which maintains an adoption reunion registry where people will register if they're trying to get back to each other. An international version is the International Soundex Reunion Registry. With regard to African American research, I tell people to go back as far as they can using conventional sources because, for one thing, slave ancestors were not enumerated in the population census. They were first enumerated usually in the 1870 census post the Civil War. They were also listed in voter registration rolls. Now, the Freedmen's Bank was an institution established post-Civil War, and that's a very useful resource. That's on Heritage Quest, but it's also available on microfilm. In the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Land Records, you may find some interesting things such as marriages and contracts and labor disputes between freed slaves and their employers at that time. With regard to slave ancestors, the slave schedules of 1850 and 1860 listed the owners, the age and sex of the slaves, but not the names of the slaves. So it's of some use, but it's limited. Slaves were often named in wills and probate records, deeds and lawsuits and courthouse records. If you're fortunate enough, there may be plantation records, diaries, and letters that may name slaves and provide some clues. With regard to Native American research, again, I would say research as far back as possible using a conventional source. We get a lot of people walking in and saying they have a Native American ancestor. They very well might, but the important key to knowing how to find them is to know what tribe they belong to. And the way you do that is you research as far back as possible. You find out the area where that ancestor lived and look for tribes in the area. Then you would look at tribal enrollment cards for that particular tribe. Those are held by the National Archives, but they are also available on microfilm. Also, there's Native American census records that are all also from the same time period. Usually this is late 19th, early 20th century. Once armed with some information that a person was enrolled in a tribe, then you can contact the tribal office of that tribe that currently exists and see if they can help the patron further. And if you have any more questions, you can contact us Blake?
At the information you see here. Our website is info.florida.gov, and that's the combined website for the State Library and Archives, so that's everything you need in one place. You can email us at the State Library email you see here, and then the State Archives email as well, and we've got our direct reference phone numbers for both the library and archives, so you'll talk to a real person waiting to help you.
And this is Melissa just popping in here. If there's more than one of you at a computer, that would be wonderful. We'd love to know that for our statistics. So if you could just type it into chat how many of you are sitting there, that would be great.
Okay, thank you very much, Miriam and Blake. And we have time for some questions now. You can raise your hand and Melissa will call on you, or you can put your questions directly into chat. So our first question is, how reliable are the Sanborn fire insurance maps?
Do you want to handle that one?
Sure. Yes, I would say those resources are the Sanborn maps are pretty reliable because those were made by the Sanborn insurance company to assess fire risk for a particular community. Like anything, it's not perfect, but I would say that's one of your more reliable primary source map materials that you can find for local history.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a question from Patricia. How do we go about keeping attendees with varying skill levels in genealogy research, learning and engaged month after month with limited resources?
The great thing is that there are a lot of resources available online that are free. So Family Search, again, has got lots of articles on various topics. You can go through the Cindy's List page for specific things that you want to learn from. And I would also say that this is where your local genealogical society may come in to be useful. So I see that, Patricia, you're from Seminole County. There is an organization called the Central Florida Genealogical Society. They've got a pretty nice looking website called cfgs.org, and that's Central Florida Genealogical Society. You may want to get in touch with them to see what kind of assistance they can provide for continuing education.
And we do have some other questions, but it is now 3 o'clock, and I just want to say thank you all for joining us. We'll be sending out a follow-up message, which will include a PDF of the slides, a bibliography of many additional resources for you to consider in your research and to help your patrons, as well as a link to a survey. We value your feedback, and I encourage you to complete that. Thank you for attending.
And we're going to keep going, so if you can stay on with us, we would love that. We're just going to make sure that all the questions get answered. We just understand that some of you have places to be and people to see. So we do have a follow-up. Celia says the city of Tampa readdressed many blocks, so using the Sanborn maps doesn't work at times.
Oh, and so one of the ways that you can, I would say, corroborate that is we do have at the State Library, we have the Florida map collection, and we have a wide array of city and county maps and basically any kind of map that you can think of. And a lot of those are available online at our library catalog, library.florida.gov. And the State Archives also has some historical maps on Florida memories. So if you have any questions about maps for Tampa or anything else, just give us a call. We can definitely help.
And we have a question about someone's looking for a picture of George Washington Witherspoon, possibly an early legislator, possibly changing political parties.
I did look that up before the webinar started. Unfortunately, it does not appear that we have a picture of him. I checked through Florida Memory through the photographic collection, but did not find one. I did look him up in a publication called People of Lawmaking in Florida, which is put out by the Clerk of the House. And it gave the information on him. It gave that he was a House member from Jefferson County. Excuse me. in 1875, 1877, 1879, and 1883, but unfortunately I couldn't find any other information about him.
Thank you. We have a couple comments. Looking forward to the bibliography. We will definitely be sending that to you. And a comment that at the Florida Atlantic University libraries, there's a LibGuide for genealogy and other resources, and you can see the link in the chat box to consider those sources as well.
That looks great.
And folks, if I could just cut in here for a second. This is Blake again. We talked earlier about organizing your research and what are some of the best practices to do that. And for those of you in academic libraries, and even for those of you in other kinds of libraries, some of the reference managers like RefWorks and Zotero, and note that you've been using, that you use with students and other patrons, can also be very useful for genealogy, because a lot of times if you're looking at a catalog record or a journal article, they can grab that metadata and import it directly into the program, and you can use that to format spreadsheets and bibliographies and lots of other things. And Zotero is free, and RefWorks is free for students as well at their institutions. So I would definitely encourage those for folks who are having trouble getting organized.
Do we have any other questions? You can put your questions or comments into chat, or raise your hand and we'll unmute you to vocalize those.
And feel free to send us an email if you think of anything else after the webinar. Miriam and I are more than happy to answer any questions.
Well, we're going to stay on and make sure that we get all of your questions answered. But if you've learned what you are hoping to learn today and you don't have any other questions, thanks for being on with us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Melissa. And thank you again to Miriam, Spalding, and Blake Robinson from the State Archives and from the State Library. This has been a wonderful collaborative effort from the Division of Library and Information Services. I hope it will be useful to you, and look for that follow-up email.
Thank you.
Thank you.